All right, class. In this lesson, we're going to look at Hume's theory of personal identity from the Treatise of Human Nature. And in this, we're going to be looking a lot at its relation to Descartes. Hume's theory of personal identity is based very closely on his theory of habit and association, which we saw in the previous lesson. So he's going to use these principles of habit and association to make sense of personal identity and to try to come up with a new theory of personal identity, very much rejecting the one of Descartes. So Descartes says that there is a substance that is immaterial and that is absolutely unified. And Hume is going to say, no, the personal identity is something that is formed by experience and through habit. So he says, there are some philosophers who imagine that we are at every moment intimately conscious of what we call ourselves, that we feel its existence and its continuance in existence, and are certain beyond the evidence of demonstration, both of its perfect identity and simplicity. The strongest sensations, the most violent passions, they say, instead of distracting us from this view, only fix it more intensely, and make us consider their influence on the self either by their pain or pleasure. An attempt, a further proof of this, were to weaken its evidence, since no proof can be derived from the fact that we are so intimately conscious, nor is there anything of which we can be certain if we doubt this. So there's Descartes. He says, but self or person is not any one impression, and that to which our several impressions and ideas are supposed to have reference. If any impression gives rise to the idea of self, that impression must continue invariably the same through the whole course of our life, since self is supposed to exist in that manner. But there is no such impression that is constant and invariable. So if we have a sense of our person or ourself, it's going to have to be something that we sense or perceive or are conscious of. So we say that it is something that is continuously invariable. So what impressions do we have? What ideas, what sensations, what experiences that are constant and invariable? He says there are none. He says pain and pleasure, grief and joy, passions and sensations succeed each other and never all exist at the same time. It cannot therefore be from any of these impressions or from any others that the idea of the self is derived. Consequently, there is no such idea. So what he gives instead is a bundle theory of identity. Everything is in flux. Everything is a continuous succession of changes. Nothing in our experience is free from this flux. So how can we have an identity? Hume doesn't think that we have no identity. He thinks that it's an obvious fact that we do have a sense of identity. So where does this come from? He says, but setting aside some metaphysicians of this kind, Descartes, I may venture to affirm of the rest of mankind that there is nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. Our eyes cannot turn in their sockets without varying our perceptions. Our thought is still more variable than our sight. And all our senses and faculties contribute to this change. Nor is there any single power of the soul which remains unalterably the same, perhaps for one moment. So nothing of any of our experiences remains the same even for a moment. Everything we experience is a flux, a change, a progression. So he says, in our last resource, it is to yield to it and boldly assert that these different related objects are in effect the same, however interrupted and invariable. In order to justify to ourselves this absurdity, we often feign some new unintelligible principle that connects and binds objects together and prevents their interruption or variation. Thus we feign the continued existence of the perceptions of our senses and remove the interruption and run into the notion of a soul and a self and substance to disguise the variation. But we may further observe that there we do not give rise to such a fiction. Our propension to confound identity with relation is so great that we are apt to imagine something known and mysterious connecting the parts besides these relations. So what we have in experience is flux and relations. And the relations are formed in the flux and by means of mental activities which are themselves fluxes. So all of our mental capacities are fluxes. Habit is a kind of flux. Senses are a kind of flux. So what we do in experience is flux together a bunch of fluxes. And then what we do is we tell ourselves that all of this variation and synthesis and fluctuation is actually an invariableness, something unchanging and something simple, when really it's something complex and changing. So the continuity of all these differences, that is what is being identified as if it was invariable. So the continuity may go through all the differences, but it is supposed that that continuity itself is invariable. But what's really at stake here is that we interpret identity as if it was something other than relationship. But what Hume wants to say is that it is absolutely nothing other than relationship. Identity is formed by the imagination, and we decide identity by an association of resemblance or causality. So there is no precise, determinate degree of change where identity and otherness is properly ascribable. This is purely by custom. So we have these different experiences in our life, and you might do something and later say, that wasn't me, I can't believe I did that, that wasn't me. So where we draw that line between what I call myself and what I call something else or not me, that line is completely arbitrary and decided by us. It's something that is subject to the law of habit and custom. So he says, but whatever precaution we may use in introducing the changes gradually and making them proportionate to the whole, it is certain that where the changes are at last observed to become considerable, we make a scruple of ascribing identities to such different objects. There is, however, some artifice by which we may induce the imagination to advance a step further, and that is by producing a reference to the parts to each other and to combine to some common end or purpose. A ship for which a considerable part has been changed by frequent reparations is still considered as the same, nor does the difference of the material hinder us from ascribing an identity to it. So here Hume is pointing at this thought experiment. We have a ship, and we start replacing the parts of it, board by board, until we have replaced the mast and the sail and every plank on the ship. All of a sudden, we have a ship that is a completely different, materially, a completely different ship. And yet we still call it the same ship. Why do we call it the same ship? Well, it resembles it. It's enough similar to it that we're able to say they're the same. We're able to form an association, a relationship between the past ship that no longer exists and the present ship, which is a completely new set of wood. So because of the common ends towards which all the parts conspire, we hold them under the same rule, and therefore the variations we ignore and say that it's just the same thing in both cases. So Hume thinks that this is similar to what goes on in our own sense of identity. And we can think here of Descartes' example of the wax. We start with something with all these concrete properties to it, smell, taste, scent, and everything. We remove all of those qualities, and yet we still say that it is the same wax. Descartes says, well, that can't be because of imagination. That has to be because of reason or judgment. Hume says, no, that's purely because of imagination. So he gives another example that gets at this same idea. He says, in like manner, it may be said, without breach of the propriety of language, that such a church, which is formerly of bricks, fell to ruin, and that the parish rebuilt the same church of free stone, and according to modern architecture. So we have this old church made out of bricks. It falls apart. The parishioners rebuild the church out of stone, and according to modern architecture. He says, here neither the form nor the materials are the same, nor is there anything common to the two objects, but their relation to the inhabitants of the parish. And yet this alone suffices to make the denomination of them the same. So we have not just one ship and another ship with the same form. We have two completely different forms, and yet we suspect there to be or we decide that there is a continuity between these two different things by forming a relationship between them in our thought. So habit, custom, imagination form a relationship between these two things. We say that they're the same because they're the continued history of the people of that region or something like that. So identity is customarily granted to expected or predictable changes. We, say, I didn't do that. That wasn't me. I wasn't the one who was really acting there. That wasn't me. Why? Well, we have a predictable, expectable way to act that we call ourselves. I'm a person who's kind, and I treated this person really unkindly. So that wasn't me, right? We say those kinds of things. And what that shows is that there is a somewhat arbitrary line that we make ourselves, that we draw, for whatever reasons. And we do give reasons, we outline why it wasn't me who did it, or why that's not the same church as the old church, or why that's not the same boat, or why it is, right? We can provide these justifications, but ultimately those justifications are made in order to reinforce the judgment that we give, that there is identity or that there is not identity. And that in the end, there's nothing that can be grounding this distinction. There's no a priori laws. There's no transcendent knowledge that tells us one and the other to go one way or the other. All the justifications are begging the question and based on habit. He says, thus, as the nature of a river consists in the motion and change of parts, though in less than 4 and 20 hours, okay, that's 24 hours. This is the English that Hume wrote in at the time. So there be a totally... so in 24 hours, the river changes completely. This hinders not the river from continuing the same during several ages. What is natural and essential to anything in a manner expected, and what is expected makes less an impression and appears of less moment than what is unusual and extraordinary. So we see the same river continuously changing, and yet we say, it's the same river because it follows the same course, right? So it's not unusual, it's not extraordinary, therefore we don't really perceive any difference. So differences are perceived, therefore, by what we expect, by what we can predict. So a considerable change of something we expect seems really less to the imagination than the most trivial alteration of what we do not expect. So, and breaking less the continuity of our thought has less influence in destroying identity. So we make these judgments based on our expectations. And if there's a massive change, but we expected it to some degree, we don't notice it. And if there's a tiny change, but we didn't notice it, but we didn't expect it, we notice it. So there's this unfair, almost impartial or partiality that we show towards these two different possibilities: breaking identity, persisting in identity. So the self is not known by the understanding then. The self is something that is only known through habit and through a contracted, habitual way of anticipating what is consistent and what is inconsistent with that identity. If we would recall what has been already proved at length, that the understanding never observes any real connection among objects, and that even the union of cause and effect, when strictly examined, resolves itself into a customary association of ideas. So everything that we said in the previous lecture. For from thence it is evidently follows that identity is nothing really belonging to these different perceptions and uniting them together, but is merely a quality which we attribute to them, because of the union of their ideas in them in the imagination when we reflect upon them. So we're not discovering anything in the thing. Just as when we look at the bread, we don't discover that it's has these secret powers, right? This nutritional power to it. What we do is we attribute based on past experience and based on habit, which is, as we said in the previous video, a completely circular form of logic. So it is therefore on some of these three relations of resemblance, contiguity, and causality that our identity depends. The very essence of these relationships consists in their producing an easy transition of ideas. So custom makes it easy to go from one thing to the next. We have one presentation, sensation, idea, memory, and we easily think of another. The association arises with ease. It follows that our notion of personal identity proceeds entirely from the smooth and uninterrupted process of the thought along a train of connected ideas, according to the principles of custom. So it's the ease of custom which shows us who we are, that gives us our self. That self is nothing but the ease of custom itself. It's not a substance, it's not a thinking thing that a priori has certain properties of judging and things like that, as Descartes says. No, it's just a process. It's just a fluctuation. A fluctuation that is easy, and a connection that is repeatable, and the repetition makes it easier to repeat in the future. So all we sense is that ease. So all we sense really is custom or habit. So what about memory? For what is the memory but a faculty by which we raise up the images of the past perceptions? And as an image necessarily resembles its object, must not the frequent placing of these resembling perceptions in the chain of thought convey the imagination more easily than one link to another, and make the whole seem like the continuance of one object? So what memory adds is an ability to easily connect resemblances among perceptions. Memory aids us. It is a useful thing for habit, because memory helps to draw out resemblances in sensation. So as memory alone acquaints us with the continuance and extent of this succession of perceptions, it will be considered upon the account chiefly as the source of personal identity. Had we no memory, we should never have any notion of causation, nor consequently of the chain of cause and effect, which constitutes our self or person. But having once acquired this notion of causation from memory, we can extend the same chain of causes and consequently the identity of our person beyond our memory, and can comprehend times, circumstances, and actions which we have entirely forgotten, but suppose in a general way to exist. So without memory, we would not have a consistent sense of self-identity. We form it through our experience of the outside world. We see these things, and then memory supplants association by which we see a resemblance or a contiguity or a cause and effect. And then once we've learned how to do that, we then just apply that to ourselves. We say that I'm like that. I have a continuity of cause and effect. I have a contiguity of time and a similarity, resemblance between my younger self and myself now. So identity is ascribed in this way. We apply it to ourselves by means of habit and memory. So Hume then brings up this Platonic kind of idea of self, relating it to a commonwealth or a republic. He says, our impressions give rise to their corresponding ideas, and these ideas in their turn produce other impressions. One thought chases another and draws after it a third, but which it is expelled in its turn, and in this respect I cannot compare the soul more properly to anything than to a republic or commonwealth, in which the several members are united by reciprocal ties of government and subordination, and give rise to other persons who propagate the same republic, and in incessant changes of its parts. And as though the same individual republic may not only change its members, it also its laws and constitutions, in like manner the same person may vary his character and dispositions, as well as the impressions and ideas, without losing identity. So you can take like the Roman government or something like that. It starts out a republic. It goes for a few hundred years. In that few hundred years, you have a continual changing of the people, right? New generations are born, people die out, and it's continually changing. It's kind of like the ship. You remove the planks and you add new ones, and you keep the same ship. Then at some point, you have empire start, right? You have overthrowing of the democratic republic or whatever, and a new constitution comes about. Well, we can still call it Rome insofar as we find a kind of continuity there. Well, the same thing goes with the continuity of identity. So he says, whatever changes he endures, several parts are still connected by the relation of causation. And in this view, our identity with regard to the passions serves to corroborate that with regard to the imagination, in making our distinct perceptions influence each other by giving us a present concern for our past or future pains or pleasures. So a consistency of concern in our passions is a causal link that allows us to easily associate these two things. In my past, I sought pleasure and avoided pain. I do that now. I can easily connect those two and think of them as united. That doesn't mean that I actually understand anything about their connection. It's merely a habitual form of knowledge. It's a groundless, irrational form of knowledge. So identity is then merely the product of connecting ideas. Identity depends on the relation of ideas, and these relations produce identity by means of the easy transition they occasion. But as the relations and easiness of this transition may diminish by increasing insensible degrees, we have no just standard by which we can decide any dispute concerning the time when they acquire or lose the title of the name identity. That's the main point there. There's no rational basis, there's no judicial, there's no completely logical way to determine where that line is. All the disputes concerning the identity of connected objects are merely verbal, except so far as the relations of the parts give rise to some fiction or imaginary principle of union, as we have already observed.